All right, thanking God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for giving us the chance to get through yet another chapter of the Word, this time First Corinthians chapter 3, that I'd like to look at from the perspective of the recurring theme, wisdom, but also the sub-theme, one that connects it, I guess, a little bit more to a familiar phrase that we use from time to time, and that's self-awareness, because I think that in this chapter, Paul is going to link actual wisdom to strong self-awareness. In this chapter that I think breaks down around, I think, 4 thoughts, but in the ESV it's 5 paragraphs. But those 4 thoughts that I think help me understand the chapter are milk, which literally comes up in the first 4 verses of the chapter, as I think the next few verses, verses 5 through 9, are probably well understood through the lens of seeds, different types of seeds, or Paul as a planter. Then he's going to switch metaphors in verses 10 through really roughly 17, talking about he also compares himself to a master builder, as the end of the chapter is going to turn in verses 18 through 23 to that concept of sobriety, or as we've titled it, self-awareness, subtitled it actually. But going back through the chapter a little bit more slowly, he uses that metaphor of milk for the level of a conversation that they are really capable of handling at this point, saying it's more like milk as opposed to solid food, which would be for the mature. Verse 2, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. As we mentioned before, a metaphor that whoever authored Hebrews is going to use in addressing that group of believers as well. It's one of the reasons why some think that Paul might have written Hebrews as well. But in talking about what they were ready for in terms of conversations about the things or the matters of God, he is then going to help them understand why they should stop chasing after either Paul or Apollos. And he's going to say just them in this chapter, but he talked about Cephas in previous chapters because it's counterintuitive to what God is actually doing. The first metaphor being in verses 5 through 9, as we mentioned, concept of seeds. He's going to describe himself as one who planted, but then Apollos is one who watered. We'll go back through and talk about how that matters. Let's just talk about it now, because that's talking about roles basically, right? But then he's going to build on that concept of roles through his next metaphor, where he's going to repeat a roles metaphor in verses 10 through 15, talking about he is a master builder. But likewise, Apollos is one, or he's going to talk about others who built on that foundation. But then he's going to extend the roles metaphor to talk about the way that the person or whoever comes after him, whether it's Apollos or anybody else, the way that they build, it matters, because we don't simply get to, or well, you get to do whatever you want, but not every manner of building is going to be rewarded. So he's going to say the way that you build matters because it's going to be tested by God. And he's going to say it's going to be tested by fire, a metaphor that closes out the Old Testament when God says that he reveals the character of a thing through fire. And a lot of times that means fiery trials. And he says, to the degree that the work stands as if it were built well, then that's credit to the one who built. The fact that they had, God willing, proceeded in a way that God approves of. But even if they lose, they still have the ability to be saved, even if their work is exposed as being faulty or being built in a faulty way on top of the foundation that in particular, Paul built. Going on in verses 16 and 17 to continue on with the building metaphor, describing them as God's temple. Understanding that, verse 17 is going to say, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. So do not get it twisted. Do not believe that just because you have the potential to be saved after having built in a potentially faulty way, that's a guarantee that you're going to get away scot-free, because you can't do destructive things to the building and expect God to repay you with anything other than destruction. He literally, I'm paraphrasing, but that's literally what he says. Therefore, in the final section, verses 18 through 23, he is going to say, don't deceive yourself, thus sobriety or self-awareness. There is quite likely a difference between the kind of loss that we can suffer for building in errant ways on top of the foundation that someone else built, and doing the kinds of things that are actually destructive or counterproductive to the structure itself. Thus, going back to the first section where he is cautioning them once again, going back to the initial warnings in chapter 1, chasing after Paul and Apollos and Cephas and whoever else as if Christ is divided is destructive. And so ultimately, there are 2 perils that we have here. One, as we already mentioned, building on the foundation with faulty material, meaning doctrine that might not be, completely consistent with what God through the Spirit is really trying to get us to understand. But there's also the potential of doing things, whether it's doctrinally or in another way, that's actually destructive to the temple of God. And so those are two different kinds of consequences. One, he's talking about, of course, building maybe through our own ideas and philosophies that don't prove to be as solid as what God is trying to get us to teach and instruct people and counsel them into doing. That means your work might be lost. But if ultimately the things that we're doing prove destructive to the temple of God, then we might have a whole different set of problems. And that seems to be what Paul is trying to get them to understand in the conclusion, where, once again, going back to that issue of sobriety or self-awareness, one of the reasons why humility is almost like an insurance policy is because it is difficult in our human understanding to understand a term that we've used before from the Hebrew, aharit, the end of a thing. God sees the end of a thing from the beginning in ways that we can't. And even with the best of intentions, there are times when we do things that are potentially destructive in ways that we don't understand. And so when he is cautioning them about thinking themselves wise, one of the things that he is hopefully helping them to understand is how they've completely lost track of how some of their habits or things that seem normal to them are actually destructive to what God is trying to get them to build. And so instead of being content or even proud about their wisdom, they actually need to be concerned, because some of the things that they're doing are more likely to attract God's judgment than any kind of praise, recognition, or commendation for the things that have been going on in Corinth. Something that he seems to pick up again in chapter 4. A chapter that, as we mentioned before, is not just a guide to the Corinthians, it is a guide, God willing, to us all, which reminds me of why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please guide us out of the kinds of habits that are more destructive that we can sometimes appreciate.